Respected chief guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon to you all. On behalf of Director General Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry and Chairman Board of Governors Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, it is my privilege to welcome you to our webinar today on illegal use of pellet guns in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Ladies and gentlemen, even as the Kashmir dispute lingers on as one of the longest unresolved disputes at the United Nations Security Council, Indian occupation forces have carried out systemic state terrorism and brutal killings to quell the struggle and agitation of the people of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir for the exercise of the right of self-determination. The Indian brutality and torture of innocent men, women, and even children is not a new phenomenon. But there are many new dimensions that have been added to it. Among others, the growing use of pellet guns against unarmed civilians who dare to raise their voices against the illegal Indian occupation of their land. It is only appropriate that we discuss this today on the occasion of the International Day in support of victims of torture. Thousands in occupied Kashmir have been blinded and permanently scarred by these so-called non-lethal pellet guns. The growing psychological trauma among the Kashmiri population in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir is a direct consequence of these ocular injuries. In a survey performed in Government Medical College in occupied Kashmir, it was found that 85% of the people blinded by pellet guns exhibited severe psychiatric disorders with high suicidal tendencies. The high-handed approach of the Indian government in dealing with peaceful protests in occupied Kashmir is evident from the fact that this weapon is not deployed anywhere else in India. What is encouraging, in fact, is that the use of the pellet guns has not gone unnoticed. In a recent annual report by the UN on children and armed conflict, the UN Secretary General has voiced deep concerns over the illegal detentions and continued use of torture and pellet guns against children, women, and men by Indian forces in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and has called upon New Delhi to immediately end such practices. Besides the UN, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, in their July 2019 update on the situation of human rights in Kashmir, classified pellet guns among the most dangerous weapons used in occupied Kashmir. Various recommendations have been made by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to the Indian government, which include, and I quote, establishing an independent, impartial, and credible investigations to probe all civilian killings which have occurred since July 2016, as well as obstruction of medical services during the unrest, arson attacks against schools, and incidents of excessive use of force by security forces, including serious injuries caused by the use of pellet firing shotguns, unquote. Recognizing the lethal effects of pellet guns, the High Commissioner has also asked the Indian government to immediately put a halt to the use of pellet guns in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Amnesty International too, in its report in 2017, Losing Sight in Kashmir, the impact of pellet firing shotguns, had also demanded that pellet guns be banned immediately in the Indian occupied Kashmir. But such voices have not been able to deter the genocide taking place in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, made even worse and dangerous by the recent constitutional changes introduced by India to institute demographic changes in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, none more insidious than the new domicile law. Ladies and gentlemen, the dream of peace and prosperity of the people of this region will remain elusive as long as India is accorded a free rein to carry on with its brutal tactics. It is our hope that this webinar today will be a contribution in shaking the international conscience before it is too late. let me at least rephrase my last sentence. Maybe it is already too late. With those remarks, ladies and gentlemen, I would request our chief guest for today, Mr. Zahoor Ahmed, for his remarks. Mr. Zahoor Ahmed is Additional Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Islamabad. Zahoor Sahab, you have the floor, sir.
Thank, thank you very much. I first of all, I'd like to thank the Institute of Strategic Studies for organizing this event. I think it has been organized at a very appropriate time because as we are all commemorating the International Day of Torture, it is important to remember the various forms of torture which the Indian armed forces and the Indian government have used on the Kashmiri people. I also was very glad to see the list of,
Can you
yes.
unmute?
Am I okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I am also delighted to see the list of participants. It includes former ambassadors like Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry and Ambassador now working with the Institute of Strategic Studies. But it also includes prominent lawyers like Mr. Bilal Sufi, Barrister Ali Sultan, who can examine the legal validity of the use of and I think this is very important. I'm also glad to see participants. I don't know whether Victoria, Dr. Andrea,
Victoria has not been able
here.
to join, sir. Victoria Schofield has rejected, sir.
Okay, okay. And Dr. Andrea from Istanbul, it's a pleasure to see you here. Also, as the true voice of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, Dr. Nazir Gilani also. I think it's important to for us as people who believe in human rights, who believe in human dignity, to make sure that the voice of the Kashmiri people reaches the rest of the world. As far as the pellet guns are concerned, there are a few things which I would like to highlight, and then I would be happy to listen to the other participants and learn from them. This is a very specific type of weapon which is not being used by any country in the world for crowd control. And India has, according to their laws, it is authorized. The armed forces and the Central Reserve Police Force, they are allowed to use it as a non-lethal weapon for crowd control. Despite this, it is not being used in anywhere else in the world. It is not being used in any other Indian state also, where there are many and insurgencies, but they are only using it in Kashmir. So it seems very clear that this is a tool of intimidation. This is a tool of torture, which India is using in order to strangle the voice of Kashmiri people for their right of self-determination. It is also, I think, something which we should all note that while the rest of the world has been condemning the use of pellet guns. There is the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2018 in her report in July 2018. The office condemned the use of this this weapon. The Amnesty International had several reports. One of Human Rights Watch had several reports, and one of them called Blind for Justice. And this is, despite all this condemnation and all this raising of voice, Indian government has not anyway been shy of using this weapon. In 2016, from July to February 2017, the then Chief Minister of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, so-called Chief Minister, Mehbooba Mufti, she said that openly that it has been fired, used on 6,221 people, and out of them 728 have had high injuries. The Central Reserve Police Force of India has told an Indian court in 2016 that they have fired about 1.3 million pellets in just 32 days. So it is not something which they are hiding. They are using it brazenly, openly, and I think experts of international law, experts of human rights, all the activists, they have to come forward and raise their voice and not only call for the right of self-determination of the Kashmiri people, but also in this particular case, urge the non-use of pellet guns on the unarmed civilians of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. One more thing which I'd like to say, that as far as the government of Pakistan is concerned, we have always condemned the use of this weapon. We stand by the Kashmiri people with all our political and diplomatic force for their right of self-determination. We urge on the international community to take notice of this, and we think that this is an issue which remains on the UN Security Council's agenda. It has been recently discussed thrice, and this has reaffirmed that this is an issue which remains there, which the world conscious cannot ignore, and it is an issue which is an issue of human rights. It is an issue which is of the right of self-determination. It is an issue which has an impact on the peace and security of the region. So with that, I thank you once again, and I look forward to listening to the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Zahoor, thank you so much for your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to our speakers. Our first speaker in line is Mr. Ahmad Bilal Sufi. By way of introduction, Mr. Sufi is the founding president of the Research Society of International Law and senior partner of the well-reputed law firm called ABS & Co., with offices both in Lahore and Islamabad. He has served as the federal law minister for parliamentary affairs and human rights in the caretaker government in 2013. Mr. Sufi was elected as a member of the advisory committee of the United Nations Human Rights Council and the vice president of its Asia Pacific group for 3 years in 2011. That's a very brief introduction, but to save time, I would request Mr. Ahmad Bilal Sufi for his remarks. Sufi Sahib, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Honorable panelists, Najam Saab, other members who are there on the panel, Khalid Saab, and your own self and ambassadors. It's been a pleasure to interact on international law in any forum, and I believe the forum and the topic that you have chosen today is very appropriate. The use of pellet guns in Indian occupied Kashmir. For any international lawyer, or for that matter, any lawyer, the use of such weapon is outrightly unlawful. You do not even need to second guess. Sometimes there are use of weaponry on which there could be divergent views. There could be a certain category of use of force against people on which one could have a disagreement on the nature, on the intensity of the force. But in certain cases, people who work in the area of human rights or in the area of humanitarian law, in their capacity as activists, practitioners, or lawyers, they are unanimous that the use of such weapon, particularly the pellet guns, is against two sets of international laws. One, international human rights law. Second, against international humanitarian law. Human rights law basically means the law that is applicable during peacetime when when you do not have a situation of military presence as extensive as we have in Indian occupied Kashmir. So in that situation, if police against an ordinary procession or people who are coming out to protest or assert their right, that is brought up, then it is outrightly unlawful under the rubric of violation of human rights. On the other hand, if there is a military presence, an extensive military presence, uniformed personnel moving around, blocking, lockdown is there, and coupled with other international law features, then obviously this is a situation of a non-international law conflict. And international humanitarian law will apply, where people who are being put into lockdown also have an inherent right to resist. So under the rubric of international humanitarian law, this will be viewed as a violation of international law. The use of pellet guns, as you have also mentioned in your introduction, is used sparingly for hunting animals. I have been associated with Worldwide Fund for Nature for the last 10, 15 years, and I chair the board right now for Pakistan. I tell you that use of such weaponry, even for animals, is discouraged, and extremely it is viewed as something that should not be done, because even in hunting animals there is uh, certain parameters that which insist that you should not put any animal to unnecessary suffering. So if there are parameters, use of pellet guns against animals is in a prohibitory zone, so obviously use by them against civilians, children, women will be an outright violation of international law, and as I said, there is no doubt about it. The use of pellet guns also begs the question where to take up this matter and where to raise this matter in terms of the violation itself, because the violations is so manifest. It's so obvious. You look at the photograph and you don't even second guess what actually happened. Sometimes, as lawyers, we have to identify a certain occurrence and prove it and establish it. Here, you don't even need to establish it. The photograph says it all, and we have seen tons of photographs of the Kashmiris who have been suppressed in Indian occupied Kashmir by the use of these pellet guns. I think the use of these guns alone needs to be taken up. It needs to be taken up not only before international forums, but also before the manufacturers of these guns. Those who manufacture these weapons now under international law have a duty for their end user, that how will the end user make use of that weapon. And it's not happening only in case of guns and other things, but all kinds of weaponry, all kinds of dual use items that are to be put to use, whether in the chemical, bio, nuclear, etc., or conventional weapons. Even the Arms Trade Treaty talks about that while you can buy arms, but when you are buying arms, you have to make sure they're not used to perpetuate violations of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law. So I think what Pakistan should also consider is to write a formal communication to the manufacturer, to the registered patent holder of this weapon, and tell him that this weapon is being misused and grossly misused in this venue. And the country of registration, wherever it is registered, is also a country's government that we should reach out to. I know for a fact of several governmental laws in various countries relating to arms control, where you have a duty as a government that your manufactured items should not be put to violation of human rights. Case in point is Italy. The Italian sniper rifles, whenever they are used against for non-combat reasons, uh, people have been filing complaints. So I think the manufacturer of the weapon is one venue or the forum that has been ignored so far by the government of Pakistan and even by the Kashmiris, something that needs to be raised. For the rest, I'm sure we have several options: Human Rights Forum, United Nations Security Council, Secretary General Office. Geneva has several forums of human rights venues where you can flash these issues. But operationally, when I think of something, I think the license cancellation of the exporter should be on the cards by virtue of the atrocities it has perpetuated. I think I'll hold back because others will also contribute. So I think my 5 to 6 minutes are kind of over. Thank you very much, Nirm Saab.
Thank you, Sufi Saab. Thank you for your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker was Syed Nazir Gilani, but he seems to be having certain technical difficulties at the moment. I hope that he will be able to join us soon. He's trying it from his cell phone at the moment. So we look forward for him to join us. But we move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Barrister Ali Sultan. Barrister Ali Sultan was appointed as Vice President of Research Society of International Law in March 2016. Earlier, he served as the Executive Director of the Research Society of International Law from 2012 to 16. During this time, he supervised the Society's projects in several areas, including counterterrorism and criminal justice system, as well as police reforms. With that introduction, Ali Saab, you have the floor, sir.
Great, thank you. First of all, let me thank ISSI for hosting this event, and I'd also like to appreciate being on such a distinguished panel, and I also appreciate the remarks that have been made by Ambassador Zahoor in the beginning, which I think has set us up nicely in terms of discussing, all the main issues that need to be discussed vis-a-vis this, this extremely important topic. Now, let me begin by endorsing what Mr. Sufi just said, which is that, when it comes to pellet guns, this is a type of a weapon on which there really is no disagreement amongst international lawyers as to whether it's legal or illegal under well-established principles of international law. And I will briefly go over precisely how those principles are violated by the use of pellet guns, shortly as well. So there's really no debate in terms of whether these are legal or illegal under international law. And the best proof of that, one of the best evidences of that, in addition to all the graphically disturbing photographs of pellet gun victims that we have, and not just recently. These photographs have come out into the public domain in the last decade or so, because we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these pellet guns haven't just recently, it's not something that the Indian security forces have started using recently, but it's something that they've been using since 2010. So the report that was mentioned, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, 2 reports, both of those reports have extensive sections dealing exclusively with the use of pellet guns. And both those reports explicitly say that the use of pellet guns by the Indian security forces in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir is a clear breach of international human rights law as well as international humanitarian law. Because as Mr. Sufi also explained, and I think this is a very, very critical distinction, which sometimes doesn't get the attention that it deserves in the context of Kashmir. That has to do with the application, the dual application of both human rights law as well as international humanitarian law. So we have both these bodies of law which are applicable to the situation in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And the use of pellet guns is illegal under both these bodies of law, whether it's international human rights law or whether it's international humanitarian law. Now, as far as international human rights law is concerned, we have a set of treaties as well as certain principles and guidelines, such as the United Nations principles on the use of firearms by law enforcement officials, which was agreed upon by the 8th United Nations Congress and is widely recognized across the globe as representing principles that have to be respected at all times by law enforcement officials. Now, those principles clearly say that every time you use a weapon such as pellet guns for riot control, you have to abide by the principles of distinction and proportionality. And before you use such weapons, you have to give prior warnings. So whenever these pellet guns have been used in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, no prior warnings have been given. They're not a proportional response to controlling a crowd which is demonstrating peacefully and asking. What are they asking? They're asking they're asking a legitimate, their concern is absolutely legitimate under international law, because the right to self-determination itself is a universally recognized right. So if they're protesting against atrocities committed by the Indian forces, this is really and those protests are peaceful, then this ends up being being a response which is not proportionate. Because remember, you may classify it as a non-lethal weapon, but in practice, this weapon has caused fatalities, and also it leads to cruel. You can say that it's cruel. Its use is cruel. It's inhuman. It's degrading. Which is why you could also say that extensive use of pellet guns is also violative of the Convention Against Torture. Now, India, despite its tall claims that that it is this defender of human rights, which are absolutely hypocritical, and this is a manifestation of Indian hypocrisy as well, when we notice that India hasn't ratified the Convention Against Torture. But that does not mean that international law on torture is not applicable on India. It applies on India as customary international law. And the law against torture also can be a basis for universal jurisdiction. So as Mr. Sufi mentioned, there are avenues where you can actually take Indian officials who've been perpetrating these acts, and you can hold them responsible under courts of certain jurisdictions at some point. So essentially, this is not a proportionate response. This could be classified as a form of torture, which is the prohibition against which is absolutely, it's absolute. It cannot be derogated from. And then, of course, the second principle which is violated is that of distinction. It's the way this weapon works is that it randomly fires lead shots. It sprays them in all directions. So under established rules of international law, you have to be able to distinguish between those you want to disperse and those who are just merely innocent bystanders in a supposed problem. So here we see women and children bearing the brunt of pellet gun injuries. So this distinction is absolutely violated in terms of the use of pellet guns. And one reason why there is absolute consensus that pellet guns should be, the use of pellet guns is illegal under all circumstances, is because it's not, they're incapable of distinguishing. It's not possible to make them in such a manner that they'll be able to distinguish effectively. So that's why there's really no debate on it. Now, in addition to that, I'm still sticking to the human rights framework, and I'll address the international humanitarian law violations afterwards. So in terms of human rights law, the next violation would be that of international covenant on civil and political rights and the right to life, because there have been fatalities as a result of the use of these pellet guns. So ICCPR article on the right of life is also definitely impaired through the use of pellet guns. Then in addition to that, there are several other international law instruments whereby the use of pellet guns would be illegal. You mentioned there are reports coming out of UN bodies which condone the use of pellet guns. They have been declared illegal, in reports by Office of Commissioner for Human Rights. And in addition to that, there are several United Nations Security Council resolutions which forbid use of such weapons against women and children, especially in conflict zones. So all of this, there's a rich body of human rights law which essentially is being violated by India. Now, in addition to human rights law, the other body of law which is applicable to Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir is international humanitarian law. more specifically, the framework of the Geneva Conventions will apply to this situation. So the fourth Geneva Convention, which deals with occupation, directly applies to IOJ&K, as does, the common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, which is known as the Martens Clause, under which the use of these pellet guns would also be illegal. Now, it's important to think of these, of this use, not just as violation of human rights, because those are just mere violations. But if we want to make it actionable under international law, then we also have to classify it as violations of international humanitarian law, because then we can trigger universal jurisdiction in other countries, as well as claim that the security forces are individually also responsible under international law for perpetrating these acts. So on the one hand, we have India, which is responsible. India is responsible as a state. But now we can and we should at some point also try to hold the Indian security forces individually responsible under international law as well. And that would be made possible if this international humanitarian law aspect is also brought into play, and it's very much in play in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So we have basically international human rights law violations, which I've listed, and I've also listed and asserted that the use of pellet guns is also a clear violation of international humanitarian law, which would also require these principles of proportionality, necessity, and distinction to be obeyed at all times. And as I said earlier, and this is important, these have not been obeyed. And also, under international procedures and standards, every time you use such a weapon for crowd control, for example, you use rubber bullets, you're not supposed to fire above the waist. But evidence of injuries, pellet gun injuries, you have like people being blinded, women and children being blinded by these pellet shots. So there is clear and ample evidence that this very well established principle has also not been obeyed. Now, lastly, let me just quickly say that the other problem with the use of pellet guns is that under international law, there should be internal accountability for such atrocities which are being committed by Indian security forces. But as someone also mentioned earlier, India has a draconian Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which gives the Indian security forces the power to actually even use lethal weapons, not just non-lethal weapons, to disperse crowds of more than 5 people. So that is an absolute abomination, this law, as far as international rule of law is concerned. So this needs to go. The international community needs to take notice of the source of the problem. Really is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act to begin with. And then the problem, of course, is exacerbated by the fact that you can never hold these forces accountable under Indian law, because under the Indian Criminal Procedure Code, they have massive near blanket immunity or indemnification for these actions. So forget about internal accountability, for such barbaric monstrosities which have been perpetrated for over a decade. So that is why it's even more important that the international community steps in and takes notice of this. And right now, after the killing of George Floyd in the US, overall, we see this in the world. There is this awakening to police brutality, and what more could be more brutal than what's been happening in IOJ&K. So I think the world should also be as attentive as it is to problems of police brutality in other parts of the world as well. So I think that's also something that needs to be said. Now, the last point I'll make is that, from a legal standpoint, is that domestically, the use of pellet guns has been challenged in Indian Supreme Court, and it's been challenged in Jammu and Kashmir High Court. But all of those forums have not declared the use of these pellet guns as illegal. So, because there is such an infrastructure of Hindutva in India, which has really seeped into all institutions of the state, whether it is the judiciary, the administration, their army, and so on and so forth, that those decisions have also not really been of any help. And in fact, if anything, they've allowed the use of these pellet guns, which is why it's absolutely, absolutely critical. And I'm glad that the Secretary General of the United Nations, has sort of, taken this up at a certain level. But more needs to be done. More sustained efforts need to be brought to the fore, in order to convince India to abide by its international law obligations and put a stop to this barbaric monstrosity that it has been committing for over a decade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali Saab. Thank you for those remarks and the explanations on the various laws, including human and humanitarian law. Thank you so much. Our next speaker on my list is Dr. Andrea Stoyan Karadeli. Dr. Karadeli is an independent expert and consultant with extensive experience in human rights and national security, impact of violence on society, terrorism and counterterrorism, and a collaborator with several organizations and institutions worldwide, including NATO, United Nations, and the EU. Dr. Karadeli, you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be among you. Thank you very much to the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, for the invitation. It is a great pleasure. First of all, please allow me to share my presentation, to share my screen.
Farhan, please do that, Farhan.
I'm a strong supporter of the power of images, so that's the reason why I prepared the short presentation for today as well.
Images have a much more impact. Please go ahead, you can share your screen.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sharing it. Is everybody able to see it? Is it okay?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, great. So today, the reason why I prepared a short presentation is because, as I said, the power of images is stronger, and also we have been treating so far the different aspects, legal, international law, aspects of the use of pellet guns. But as I work in counterterrorism and I kind of have expertise in the way guns and weapons are used, I would like to look more into the technical part and also the symbolism of using pellet guns in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So if I would go first to say, now that I would explain you what a pellet gun means and how it works, imagine, while to provide you with the information, that you are the target of such a weapon. So, of course, the pellet guns are a form of shotguns. They were first used by police as a non-lethal weapon to quell protests in Indian administered Kashmir in 2010. And they are normally used for hunting animals. And I want you to focus a little bit on this, because this is why the symbolism of using them is pretty much important. And I will get back to this in a minute. The gun fires a cluster of small round-shaped pellets, which resemble iron bolts at high velocity. They can contain up to 500 such pellets, which this is the reason, or this is the place where their power comes from more exactly. When the cartridge explodes, the pellets disperse in all directions. They are actually less lethal than bullets, but they can cause serious injuries. And the speakers that have taken the floor before me have mentioned some of those injuries, and they are like lifelong sentences, basically. Especially if they hit the eye, and people can remain blind after such an attack. So it was mentioned already the fact that in 2016, India said it would reconsider the use, but it's obvious today, and various statistics confirm it. Videos and information from the place confirm it as well, that they are still being in use. So I wanted you to see exactly what it can happen. Like, as long as you get such a so you are the target of such an attack, as it disperses, you get it all over. You can get it all over the body. At more than 50 meters, it also has the capacity to blind and maim. The mortality rate when it comes to 5 meters, close to 5 meters, it's 85 to 90%. And its effective range is 35 to 45. But when it comes to, you know, the meaning or the symbolism behind the anatomy of this, behind what it does physically to the person who is target to such an attack, is the symbolism of the fact that this is not a weapon that should be used or has the purpose to be used to people. This is a hunting weapon, actually. So there are two meanings that I would kind of take out of this. First is the degradation of the victims, humiliation of the victims, not having them treated as human beings. Like in terms of criminology or criminal psychology, the way a person decides to use the weapon says a lot of the personal insights towards the target. So the symbolism, what I would like to emphasize beyond the use and the technical aspects of using the pellet guns and their harm, is the fact that in terms of the symbolism towards the target, towards the people that are the target of such a pellet bombs, is the deconsideration of the human aspects of the people that are targeted as being human beings. And I've been going, in order to prepare for this presentation in my previous researches as well, I've been going through all the cases that have been released to the international side, because it's not just the UN, it's also there are several international organizations that have taken and have tried to have a loud voice in terms of, you know, putting an end to this. And there are a lot of cases of children that have been there by mistake. They have been there just physically, not protesting, not being involved in any political action, but they were hit, and most of them were killed, or some of them even remained with injuries for life. So now comes the real question, because I'm the kind of person who says it the way, I'm an academic as well, and I say the way it is. And I do believe that beyond the power of those images is the fact that, as all of us have loved ones, what if these were actually your children, your loved one, the persons that have been part of your family, of your circle for a long while? What if, you know, the international scene, unfortunately, no matter how loud we speak, no matter how loud our resolutions come up, they still don't stop what happens on the ground. And that's also because we still have that very wrong impression that what happens in one corner of the world does not affect us from the other side, but actually it does. Because, you know, killing one person is killing one nation at the same time. It's killing the whole humanhood at the same time. So what would I always, as I do research, and as I use my expertise, I always try to come up with solutions, because there's no reason to research. There's no reason to bring up so many statistics, to bring up so many arguments, if you don't come up with a solution. So there were two things that, two main ideas that came up to my mind when it came to how we can put a stop to this. First, it was the international awareness campaigns. And that's because although UN has been pretty vocal, Amnesty International has been pretty vocal, other international organizations have been pretty vocal in terms of the atrocities that are taking place in the occupied territories. We have to be aware that that's not enough. And the best international campaigns are the ones that start from the region, that start from the place, that presents the situation as it is, that comes up with the real cases and the way they have been affected. So one of the recommendations that I would have is to have an international commission especially created for this, for this case, and especially, bringing up, creating with the real cases from the ground. Then the second one, and that's the political side of the story, and that's the diplomacy, international relations wise. It's a greater international pressure on India to put a hold on the use of pellet guns. And that should not be done just by resolutions, just by political words. This should be done in terms of, carrots and stickers at the same time. Yeah, you cannot just write a resolution, ask them to put a hold on, and at the same time expect them to do this without being any, without presenting any punishments for not sticking to the resolution. So I think the pressure should be bigger in other ways of of convincing, not just political words, not just simple resolutions, and not just simple diplomacy, talking diplomacy, as I like to call it. I want to be pretty short, so I will conclude here. I would be more than happy to join the conversation with further questions. But this is what this is the line with I would like to conclude today. This definitely has to put a stop. And the way to raise awareness and to get the people, the international community's awareness, is by helping them understand the situation, by making them put themselves in those people's situation. This is why I would like to conclude by the question, what if these were your loved ones? Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be looking forward for the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karadeli. Thank you, respected speakers, for your comments. We've been waiting for Dr. Nazir Gilani to join us, but unfortunately, I think because of his technical difficulties, he has not been able to join us for this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, with all those presentations, we are now open for an interactive discussion and Q&A. Please, we are now open for your questions. Please unmute your mic and raise your question, and please identify the speaker you're addressing.
Please continue.
It would seem that everybody seems to be well educated and satisfied with the comments that were presented by our speakers. Since there are no questions, may I now request Chairman, Institute of Strategic Studies, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, for his concluding remarks. Sir.
Thank you, Najim. First of all, I want to join you in extending my warm welcome and also appreciation to our chief guest, Mr. Zahoor Ahmed, as well as other distinguished participants in this webinar, Amir Bilal, Sufi, Barrister Ali Sultan, and Dr. Andrea. Now, this webinar our institute has organized to mark the United Nations International Day in support of the victims of torture. Now, torture is something which has been engaging the attention of the international community since long, and consequently a big corpus of law, international law, has developed to prevent, mitigate use of torture. See, the Convention against torture, it defines torture as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person. And this, of course, is a longish definition, but that is the gist. And then Article 3, which is common to the 1949 Geneva Conventions and additional protocol, also states that the detainees must be treated humanely in all circumstances. They should be protected against murder, torture, as well as cruel, humiliating, and degrading treatment. And Article 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also asserts that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. So it means that, as has been rightly pointed out by experts here, that both under international humanitarian law and under international human rights law, no kind of torture in any form is accepted under international law. And it doesn't mean there are no instances of torture. Of course, right from United States to even other countries, there are examples of torture being used against so many people. No country is perfect, I must say. Even Pakistan, our Minister for Human Rights yesterday said that we are doing everything possible through legislation and police reforms and all these things to come up to the international standard. But what's happening in occupied Indian-held Jammu and Kashmir is that this is a state policy. Of course, India is not a party as yet to the Convention Against Torture because it has not ratified the treaty. But as was pointed out by Barrister Ali Sultan, that under customary international law, India is also obliged not to practice torture in any form. And what's happening in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, we all know. It is a very sad and grim, picture, which one obtains from so many sources. It is, all kinds of wanton killings, torture, rape, extrajudicial killings. They have been all very extensively documented by human rights organizations, that how the draconian laws, OTA, TADA, ISSI, AFSPA, how they give immunity or they provide impunity to the police and law enforcement agencies when they commit these heinous acts. See now, according to some reports, out of 6 Kashmiris have faced torture. And Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons and Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society has documented hundreds of cases of use of torture against helpless Kashmiri people in the Indian occupied Kashmir. Of course, this is a weapon, as was pointed out, mainly used in animal hunting, but as Barrister Bilal Sufi, Amal Sufi was pointed out, that even there are certain rules, regulations, which SOPs which one has to follow. And all this is disregarded by the occupation forces in Indian occupied Kashmir. See, it is one thing, of course, when torture is used, it causes pellet guns are used. They cause, loss of life. Sometimes they can cause paralysis if they hit the spinal cord. They can result in defacement of the person. And sometimes if they hit the vital organs, heart or kidney or something, even it can result in deaths. But what's also equally important is that it leads to psychological trauma afterwards, how you have been treated like, as I said, animals, indiscriminate firing. As Dr. Andrea was pointing out, psychological impact, the symbolism involved to have been treated not like a human being, but like animals. So naturally and consequently, all the major international organizations, intergovernmental and non-governmental, have condemned this use of pellet guns. Amnesty International, the recent report of the UN on children in armed conflict, Human Rights Watch, and more importantly, the Human Rights Commissioner's reports of 2018 and 19. All have criticized this practice and called for stoppage of such a practice. But a number of recommendations have been made, and I think they all need very careful attention. Foremost, of course, so we have to support the proposal by the United Nations Human Rights Commissioners made in their two respective reports, that there has to be fact-finding mission, commission of inquiry. What is the state of affairs to confront Indian assertion as if everything is hunky-dory in Indian occupied Kashmir. Secondly, I think one could also, apart from all those very valid, important recommendations made by all the previous speakers, I think one could also consider that the situation could be presented to the to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to pursue this matter, to refer the situation in occupied Kashmir to a prosecutor of International Criminal Court. And other proposals are also really very weighty. But before concluding, I just want to say this should not deflect us from the root cause of all the what's happening there. The root cause is the denial of the right to self-determination of the people of Kashmir, which was assured to them by the international community under international law and also through the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, which was prescribed a solution to all these problems. That is exercise of the right of self-determination by the people of Kashmir through an impartial plebiscite to be conducted under the auspices of the UN. I think that remains the basic problem. Otherwise, there can be phases when there can be less violation of human rights, more violation of human rights, but this problem will not go. It could perhaps have aggravated under this new regime in India under the chauvinistic, nationalist, government of Modi. I think the earlier this Kashmir dispute is resolved in accordance with international law and the UN Security Council resolution, earlier the better it is for the people of Kashmir, for the peace of the region, and for the people of India, Pakistan. And I think we should never lose focus of that fundamental requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your concluding remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, it would seem to me, as Sufi Saab had pointed out, that even animals have a right to be spared the torture. It would seem to me that the Indians are treating the Kashmiris even less than animals. I think they believe that Kashmiris are not human beings at all, and they can use all kind of torture and get away with it, secure in the knowledge that they would neither be persecuted internally nor by the international community. And that seems to have given them the strength to carry on with the use of all kinds of torture and repressive measures against the occupied Kashmir they have in their hands. And I think they have no intentions of letting go. We need to be much more forceful in terms of pushing the case forward for the Kashmiris. And and no amount of commissions is going to do that. And in all my years, I have found that if you want to pen something, you institute a commission, and the case would be prolonged and pended for whatever years you want to. I believe the answer lies somewhere else. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I would like to thank both our chief guest, Mr. Zahoor Ahmed, and our learned speakers for having joined us for this webinar today. Thank you so much for sparing time and sharing your views with us. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum and Allah Hafiz. Take care and stay safe.